Great. Thank you very much, Lucy. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today, for sparing an hour for this talk. I'm delighted to see so many of you here and from so many different places. And let's get straight into the topic of the session. It's all about using assessment as a learning tool. And I'm going to run through a range of practical options. And we're going to look really at the role of assessment in teaching and learning to start with. Then we're going to focus in really on assessment for learning and why is it so important. And then we're going to look at one or two ways in which we can put it into practice simply and effectively without creating a whole load of extra work for you as the teacher. Okay, so first of all, a question for you, and there'll be a few of these as I go through the session. Just if you think of the word assessment, what kind of words spring to mind? What do you associate with the word assessment? So can you think of 3 words that immediately spring to mind for you and write them in the chat? And let's just have a look at the kind of things that, that this prompts in your mind. Word assessment. Okay, so we've got test, evaluation. Good morning from Mexico. That's good. Further messages. Yeah, feedback, guidance, great. That will be central to some of the things that I'm talking about. So it's about orienting students, giving feedback, giving them guidance. Yeah, progress, objectives, opportunity to improve, absolutely. Okay, so lots of great thoughts and ideas there, and a lot of them are in line with the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about today in terms of assessment for learning. I quite like this mind map of words commonly associated with assessment because 3 of the biggest words here are students. It's important that assessment is focused on the students and their particular needs. But also the fact that learning is a really important word here. It's not just assessment for the sake of giving a score or giving students a grade. And therefore, the formative word is also really important here. And that's really all about the topic of today's talk, assessment for learning. Much more about that to follow. But let's look a little bit at the role of assessment in teaching and learning. So there are various key questions that you might consider when thinking about this. And we'll go through each of these in turn in a second. So firstly, how often, and thinking about you in your particular context and your particular students and your classes, how often do you assess your students is one question. What types of assessment do you use? Really importantly, why do you test your students? Why do you assess them? Why do you evaluate them? And then what do you do with the information that you get? How do you actually put that into some kind of practical, useful purpose? So firstly, how often do you assess your students? There are various possible answers to this. Could potentially be never, although probably that's unlikely. It could be after every unit in your course or in your course book. Could be mid-course, end of course. Could be whenever you think the students are ready. It could be as often as possible. It could be that you think you're doing this all the time. Again, I'd like you to think about yourself and your particular context and how often you assess your students. Can you type any of the numbers in that list from 1 to 7? Any of those numbers that apply to you and how often you assess your students? Just type them into the chat. You can put more than one, obviously. You can put almost all of them if you want. Okay, we've got 3, 4, 6, 7, 7, 7, 7, 6, 6, 2, 6, 2. Yeah, great. Okay, really good to see that there are no number 1s yet. So none of you are saying that you never assess your students. I think that is, I would have thought in most situations, an accurate view. Okay, lots of 6s and 7s here as well, which is great to see as often as possible and all the time. We'll look at what that may mean in practice in a second, but we'll look now at the second of those questions that I showed you earlier. What types of assessment do you use? So it could be, for example, your own informal observation in the classroom. This is likely to be the case. Whenever you're teaching, you're your students, you'll be noticing things that they're able to do, things where they need further support, further help, things they're good at. Could be that you use tests that you write yourself or that you adapt. Could be tests given to you by your school or your institution. Could be published tests, tests you find online. Maybe even number 6, you never use tests. Again, question for you, what types of assessment do you use? Again, it can be any of these numbers or multiple numbers. Just type the numbers in the chat, the ones that apply to you. Okay, we've got 1 to 5, 1, 3, 5, 1 and 5. Ulbo there saying, I tell my students, you get evaluated from the moment you walk in the school door to the moment you leave to go home. Yeah, a valid comment. Okay, so lots of different ones there. Again, no 6s here. So you all use various types of tests. Lots of instances of number 1, where you're informally observing what students are doing in your classroom. Okay, great. And then we'll move on to a really key question here. Why do you test your students? And, you know, this is probably the fundamental question. It could be something as prosaic as because, you know, they expect to be tested. It's something that we all expect, whatever we're doing in life, I guess, to be assessed in what we're doing. It could be something relatively narrow and limited, like giving them a grade. This is important sometimes to be able to, you know, in terms of a competency test, give students a score, give them a grade, see how they have, you know, where they've got to in their learning. It can be to monitor their progress and for you to sense check how they're moving along the learning path that they're following. It could be in order to give you an opportunity to give them feedback in terms of how they're doing. That in turn can help to boost their motivation, assuming that, you know, things are looking positive, and if this is done quite regularly. It can also be in terms of 6 and 7, and this is where we move into the idea of assessment as a learning tool and the idea of formative assessment, so that you can recommend appropriate activities, practice activities, or remedial presentation activities, whatever, to help them where they need help. And as part of that, it's also potentially helping you as a teacher to decide what you might need to teach or to reteach or to recap on as a next step to help your students. So, you know, you'll be familiar, I assume, with the term summative assessment and formative assessment. Summative being or tending to be more formal and the kind of assessment that happens at an end of a period of study, not necessarily the end of the year, but at the end of a period of study, often linked to formal criteria or a syllabus that you may be following. Often this kind of assessment is aiming for validity and reliability. Sometimes the perceived downside is that it's just grading, just giving the students a score. But it is important. This is an important part of the whole assessment sort of panorama. But it's really assessment of learning, of the learning that has already happened, and it's in effect backward looking, whereas formative assessment is more about looking forward, tends to be, you know, it's happening all the time ideally, and it tends to be less formal. It can be progress tests, can be you in the classroom observing your students. And it's really about keeping in touch with your learners' changing and evolving needs, and then helping you to make decisions about what to do next to help them most. So it's very much forward-looking, and you could say that, you know, summative assessment is assessment of learning that has happened. This is more assessment for learning in terms of what happens next. That phrase, it helps me to decide what to teach next, and this is really at the heart of using assessment as a learning tool, and indeed a tool for planning your teaching. Just thinking about that distinction there between summative assessment, you know, the assessment of the learning that has already happened, and formative assessment, the forward-looking type of assessment. And looking at these 7 examples, so a final exam or a test at the end of the school year, a driving test, a public exam like Cambridge First, for example, number 4, a practice test that could lead to further practice activities, a speaking activity followed by feedback either from you or from other students, written homework followed by feedback from you to the learner, or an online activity, you know, those types that allow you to check which ones you've got right, which ones you've got wrong, have another go, keep going until you get them all right. Of these, which of them would you say are formative assessment? And again, little task for you, just type the numbers in the chat, the ones that you think are formative assessment. Okay, so yeah, I can see that most of you are saying 4, 5, 6, and 7, or some combination of those four, the last four in the list. And I think you're right in that, you know, they are the ones that are most obviously formative, because clearly they each present an opportunity to follow up with, you know, they provide information that allows you to follow up with further learning that's going to be targeted based on what students need. I would say that there's not really a clear-cut answer to this, though. The other three, the final test, final exam at the end of a school year, a driving test, and a public exam, could also all offer formative opportunities, depending on whether there is feedback available and whether that feedback then leads into learners having a better idea about what they need to do next, or indeed you as a teacher having that information. So 4, 5, 6, 7 are the most obviously formative examples here, but you know, it's not entirely clear cut. And I guess it's a question of mindset and looking all the time for opportunities to use assessment in all its various forms for a formative purpose, to help with the learning process and using it as a tool for learning. If I move on to the next slide, so that phrase, it helps me to decide what to teach next. I like this phrase from Carol Ann Tomlinson, saying that assessment is today's means of modifying tomorrow's instruction. And, you know, a question, why is this important? Well, obviously it's because, you know, our students may, within a single class, within a class group, have a goal that is shared, or a set of goals that they share, that they're all heading towards, but the paths that they take are going to be different. And, you know, they won't all follow exactly the same path towards the goal that they've got there on the horizon. They'll go off on their different tangents, down their different paths. And it's important that you can keep a track of where your group as a whole is, but also where your individual students are, and where they may need support or further challenge to keep them on that path towards their goals. And, you know, this is reflected in this learning and assessment cycle, which, you know, it's not rocket science. It won't be news to you. It's a fairly obvious cycle, starting at the top, you know, setting and having very clear learning objectives, teaching objectives, carrying out episodes of teaching and learning, assessing, you know, while that teaching and learning is happening, that idea of the ongoing assessment in various forms, as well as the more summative types of testing that happen at the end of a period of study. Then considering the evidence of the results of all those varying types of assessment, the kinds of things we were looking at earlier in terms of the different types of tests and assessment that you use. And then crucially, not just kind of, you know, leaving that to one side, but actually using it as something that is a resource for you as a teacher to make decisions, and also for learners to be better informed about what they can do to help themselves in that bottom box there, to decide next steps. And that may mean revising your objectives, their objectives, and then going through the cycle again. And the important thing here is that this cycle is done regularly and often, so that you know, the objectives don't go out of date and don't become divorced from where students currently are and what they're going to be able to do next as they move towards those longer term goals. So it's a simple cycle, but, you know, as we'll see, possibly easier said than done on a regular basis. And it does need to be regular to be effective. We'll just look a little bit about, you know, what does the research say about that cycle, but also what are the most effective learning techniques and learning strategies. And there was an important meta-study carried out a few years ago by Donlowski and others that looked at common techniques, common learning techniques and strategies, and to identify the ones that were the most effective. And they looked at various ones. I've selected 5 of them here, all quite common practices, quite common techniques. So just simply rereading things that you've been studying, highlighting and underlining, practice testing. So this is that idea of formative assessment, not testing just in order to give students a score, but giving them regular practice tests. Cramming, which is when you try to squeeze a lot of learning into a very small period of time. Maybe you've got a test coming up the next day, and the student basically sits down the previous evening and studies for 3 hours and tries to cram all that knowledge into their brain for the test the next day. And then the last one listed here, distributed practice, sometimes called spaced repetition, where you revisit the same thing various times over a period of time. So of these common study strategies, learning techniques, 2 of them are very useful. They have very high utility, and 3 are quite low utility. Question for you, and again, if you can type into the chat box, can you type the 2 that you think are the most useful? So which 2 do you think have the highest utility out of these 5? Okay, so we've got highlighting and underlining and distributed practice from Samuel, distributed practice, practice testing, distributed practice. Yeah, 2 and 5, highlighting and underlining, distributed practice. First 2. Okay. So I think most of you are going for practice testing and distributed practice. I think the practice testing is probably quite a good assumption based on the topic of today's session. In fact, let's have a look. A key finding from that meta-study, Donlowski and others, was that various commonly used strategies can be very ineffective or even detrimental to learning. And those that they found were actually, in that category of not being very effective were things like rereading, highlighting and underlining, and indeed cramming. They were found to be, although very popular and very common, and often the first thing that students might think of if they're not sort of guided towards more effective techniques. They're quite inefficient. They may take time and not lead to at least long-term retention of what the students are trying to learn. Cramming, for example, it can be effective as a means of preparing for a test that you have the next day. It's not bad for the short-term memory, but it doesn't really help with that knowledge sticking in the longer-term memory. So these common strategies tend to be not particularly effective. And the ones that were found by that research, this big meta-study, to be the most effective study strategies were, as many of you put in the chat, practice testing, often referred to as retrieval practice, so formative assessment done regularly, and then distributed practice, regular practice, revisiting things over a period of time regularly, spaced repetition. And both of these are reflected in the cycle that I've been talking to you about here. You clearly have their practice testing going on a regular cyclical basis, and then you have the distributed practice that follows the assessment. Ideally, it's distributed practice that is differentiated and changed according to what that particular group needs or what particular students within that group need based on the evidence of the assessments that you're carrying out. There was an interesting stat from that meta-study. Performance on a final test was substantially greater after continued testing, i.e. practice testing. They got 80% rather than purely continued study, where the results were much lower. So, this cycle is based on the research known to be effective, and that distributed practice and practice testing being central to it. So a question, how does that make you feel? Do you feel great? That's kind of what I've always known, what I've always wanted, and this is something that I do all the time, and it's just a kind of central part of the way that I teach and the way that my learners learn, and it makes me happy. Or potentially it could sometimes leave you feeling a bit like this, where there are challenges, although it's a simple cycle, this learning and assessment cycle. There are various challenges that you may encounter when trying to put it into practice regularly and often, which is, as I've said, what needs to happen for it to be really effective. Kind of challenges you may come across, lack of time is probably the biggest one. If you're thinking, about, how many classes do you have at any one time? How many students do you have in each of your classes? Multiply that up and then think about, all of that assessment in different forms for all your students, on a very regular basis, or even all the time, in inverted commas, as we've been saying. Planning those assessments, marking things, making a note of the results, considering the implications, finding follow-up activities, monitoring progress in the follow-up activities. That's quite a big burden, potentially, a lot of work for the teacher. Also, you need to think about, if it's you in the classroom and you're observing and noticing what your students are able to do and where they may need support or extra challenge. Making a mental note is one thing, but that kind of information is likely over time to sort of fade or disappear. So, potentially lack of time or methods about how you actually make those, record those notes from what you observe in the classroom. And also, as I've said, maybe just large classes and large numbers of students for you to keep on top of, really, in terms of where they all are. And then also maybe, and I'll come to this later, the fact that digital tools these days do offer the opportunity to do this kind of thing also outside of the classroom in a way that takes some of the burden off your shoulders as the teacher. But there may not always be the opportunity to use those digital tools either for you or the students. So various challenges that you could encounter when putting this into practice. But this cycle does need to be done regularly to be effective. So arguably, teachers, for you to implement this, you need solutions, whatever they may be, both for the classroom and potentially for students to do outside of classes as well, for you to regularly and in various ways assess what they can and can't do, and support them both as a class group but also individually. And learners need help with tips about how to study effectively. So not doing underlining and rereading, but practice testing and distributed practice being the most effective. But then also individual support and advice in the areas where they, maybe they're not quite so good yet, and they need help and support to get better. So if these things are necessary, what I'd suggest is that it's a combination, ideally, of the human and the machine working together, you could say. So you as the teacher in the classroom with your students, helping to support them through your observation and the feedback that you can provide to them, allied to digital tools that students can use to support their learning, to personalize their learning outside of the classroom, also to do tests of a formative nature outside of the classroom that then provide them with practice that they need as an individual based on what the tests show they need, based on their performance in the tests. So a combination of the human and the digital, if you like. Let's look first at the role of the teacher in that equation. And I quite like this mind map, not just the shape of it, but there's a lot of nice words here that align with my understanding of key parts of what it is to be an effective teacher, being a facilitator, a mediator, a cooperator, a comforter, a motivator, an inspirer, a praiser, as well as various other things that are shown there. You've got assessor also in the middle, and that is also important, as well as those very human sort of softer areas that I mentioned. The teacher in the classroom as an assessor and an evaluator is also really key, not in the same way, obviously, as when you do your driving test, and the driving examiner is a scary individual, probably, because your future ability to drive depends on that person, what they decide on based on your performance. But as an assessor and evaluator who will help learners to get better and to guide them in what to do next. So there are many ways and many stages within a lesson in which you may be evaluating your learners, even if the primary objective is more of a learning objective. So, here are various stages that could occur in a typical lesson: eliciting new language from students, the target language that you are planning to introduce in that lesson, eliciting to see what they know already. Concept checking, once you've introduced, presented the language, checking that they understand the concept, drilling them, then controlled practice in oral or written form, moving on to freer practice, fluency activities, freer writing activities, comprehension activities, etc. And the point here is that all of these can potentially have dual aims. They can have learning aims, but they can also at the same time have assessment aims. Not assessment in the kind of scary sense of pass or fail, but assessment for learning, assessment in a formative sense. So if we look at some examples of that, question for you: which lesson stage might have these aims? So dual aims, as I mentioned. So the learning aim in this particular lesson stage is to provide very controlled practice of new language. The assessment aim for you as the teacher and what you're going to be noticing is to check that learners can pronounce new language intelligibly. And that's the list of those lesson stages. The question for you, again in the chat, can you type the number of the lesson stage that you think could have these dual aims, the learning and the assessment aim? There may be more than one, potentially. It's not necessarily just. So we've got 5, 1, 4, 8, 2, 2, various ones. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so various possible answers. And I think that's right. There's not necessarily a single answer to this, but I was thinking here of drilling in this particular case. So providing very controlled practice of the new language. And as you're drilling the students and hearing what they can produce, you're focusing on whether they can achieve intelligible pronunciation. You'll also be looking at the things like accuracy, grammatical accuracy, etc. But drilling is one possibility here. Okay, we'll do a second one. And again, the question: which of these stages could have these dual learning aims? So, sorry, dual aim. The learning aim is to involve learners in the presentation and to focus their attention. And your assessment aim is to check if learners can already use the new language. Which one do you think that would be? Okay, got various ones. Again, someone says all, could potentially be. The one that I had in mind here is at that initial stage when you're eliciting prior to presenting the new language. So checking if learners already know or can use to some degree the new language that you're thinking of presenting to them in that particular lesson, kind of a diagnostic stage at the beginning. Another one, the dual aims: the learning aim to offer learners the opportunity to put language into practical use, and the assessment aim for you to be able to check how well learners can use new language for communication. Again, if you type the number in the chat. Okay, again, we've got various possibilities here. The one I had in mind was when you move into the slightly freer practice stage, whether it's oral or written, with the focus here on using new language for communication. So moving beyond that controlled practice stage and into actually freer practice. And I think we'll just do one more. So the learning aim here is to help learners understand the concept of the language, a bit of a giveaway there. And the assessment aim, check learners have understood before you proceed to the subsequent stages. Yeah, 2, 2, 2, yeah. Okay, most of you are putting 2. It's not a very good test question from me there because the key word is in both the learning aim and the list. So yeah, concept checking was the one that I had in mind for that one. So the point here is that there are lots of stages during any lesson where you can be assessing, in inverted commas, your students. And going back to that idea of assessment being something that happens all the time while you're in class with your students. Hopefully this just demonstrates that point, that you can be doing it at all kinds of different stages of the lesson. So a key question, and going back to something that I had near the beginning, what do you then do with that information? So what happens to all this information? Could be various things. It could be that over time it slowly gets forgotten. It could be that it becomes less relevant as well because your students are moving on, obviously, and they're what they can do is changing. But if you have 5, 6 classes with 20, 25 students in each class, it would be easy potentially to forget useful detail about the things that you're noticing in the classroom, unless you're kind of proactive in how you record it and make a note of it and then go back and reconsider it. It may be that you just make a mental note and you bear it in mind. That can be valid and useful. And you add it to your general understanding of your learners as you fill in that picture, the shifting picture of each of them and where they each are along their learning path. It might be that you actually note it down for later and come back to it and maybe use it when you have conversations with your students. It may be that there's a requirement, I guess that in many cases there will be a requirement within your institution to record this kind of thing and report on students' progress at intervals during the course, and having this kind of thing noted down may help you in that respect, as well as helping the students to improve by you giving them the right kind of guidance. So I guess a key point here in terms of the teacher role in the classroom is just emphasizing the importance of that active monitoring of your students and what they're able to do, but then also thinking about how are you going to remember that important information so that you can then use it to their benefit. So how are you going to collect it? Just a mental note? Are you going to record it in some way? And some of the questions you might like to consider are, how are you going to listen out for these things in the classroom? Is it you listening while students are speaking individually? Is it while they're working in groups and pairs? Are you quietly standing back and monitoring without being too intrusive? Are you going to sit down with them sometimes and actually clearly be listening to specific groups or individuals? As you're doing that, how and when are you going to be recording the information? There's no correct answer to this, but just something to consciously think about so that the information isn't just forgotten. Who are you going to be listening to? Because probably not realistic to be listening to all your students all the time. So, if you build up this picture of your learners, the better the picture is that you're building up, the easier it will be to make decisions about who you should be listening to in this particular lesson or for this particular area of language based on what you know about them and how they've been doing. The next question, who listens? Sometimes it can be you as a teacher, but also students listening to each other and providing peer-to-peer feedback. Then also you need to listen, decide what you're going to listen out for, because you're not going to be just commenting on everything all the time. That wouldn't be practical or particularly useful for the students. So are you going to be focusing in on on accuracy or their fluency in a particular activity. What is it that you're going to be particularly listening out for and targeting for on a particular occasion? And then what do you do with the information? We'll just do a little example where we're going to listen to a student talking about what her sister did last weekend. And going back to that question about the second last question on the screen there, what are you going to listen for? What are you going to listen out for? This is slightly artificial in that you don't know the student, we're not in the classroom, and I'm kind of dropping you in at the deep end with this particular individual. But there's a task for you here to listen to this girl who's talking about what her sister did last weekend. And just while you're listening, I'd like you to make a note, whether it's a mental note or just jot things down. Make a note of the points that you would feed back to her. And remember, obviously, to consider the positives in terms of the things that she's doing well, but also the things that you think she should try to improve the next time she tries either this task again or a similar task. So I'll play the audio for you. It's not too long, less than a minute, and just make a note of those points that are on the screen.
Last Saturday, my sister go see a photo exhibition with her friend. The exhibition called 1,000 Faces because all the photographs were portraits. Most them black and white. My sister not usually like a black and white photo, but this portrait was great. She thought some looked like drawings. And the people in the photos wasn't all of them smiling. Some was sad, some looked angry, and some looked surprised. It was cool. The exhibition is open until end of November. Don't miss it if you liking photographs or if you enjoying look at people's faces.
Okay, I won't play that one again. You'll hear another attempt in a second, but I'm interested, before I show you what I would pick up on, maybe just type in the chat anything in particular that you noticed. Yeah, some good vocabulary, yeah, improved tense, word stress, vowel stress, grammar, yeah. It would be good to use pauses from one idea to the other. Yeah, grammar mistakes, pronunciation is a bit of a problem. Yeah, the accent's quite strong, rhythm, stress, and vowel sounds. It's a coherent message. Yeah, that's positive. Like grammar mistakes and pronunciation. Yeah, okay. So yeah, you picked up on, I think, largely the things that I would have said. So this is the transcript of what she said. I won't go through the detail of this, but if you skim through, you'll see that there are particularly some grammatical errors relating to verb forms. I think what I would pick out probably would be, as someone said, the vocabulary is quite good, so lexical range is not bad. Pronunciation is not great, although generally intelligible, even if not sounding particularly sort of natural, and sometimes it was a bit of a strain to work out what she was saying, but generally relatively intelligible, reasonably fluent, in terms of there was a steady flow, but again, as someone said in the chat box, maybe thinking a bit about where to pause between ideas to make it easier for the listener to follow what you're saying, and then areas to focus on. Yeah, plenty of grammatical inaccuracies, particularly with verb forms, so past simple forms, missing auxiliary, ing or infinitive. Some individual sounds were not correctly pronounced, which could cause a strain on the listener and could affect intelligibility. And then the intonation kind of felt very sort of robotic and monotone, and people mentioned that in the chat also. That would be an area to focus on. So we're now going to listen to the same girl having another go after imagine you've fed back to her and you pointed out the things that I showed you on that previous screen, things for her to think about, and now she has another go at the same task. This time I'd like you to make a note of things that she has improved and anything that you think she still needs to focus on further. again, either just make a mental note, jot something down, or pop it straight in the chat if you prefer. Okay, so this is attempt 2.
Last Saturday, my sister went to see a photo exhibition with her friend. The exhibition was called 1,000 Faces because all the photographs were portraits. Most of them were black and white. My sister doesn't usually like black and white photos, but these portraits were great. She thought some looked like drawings. And it was interesting because some people in the photos weren't smiling. Some were sad, some looked angry, and some seemed surprised. It was really fascinating. The exhibition is open until end of November. Don't miss it if you like photographs, especially if you enjoy look at many different faces.
Yeah, that's an important point, Carmen. You're saying that what you decide to correct and what you decide to make a note on should depend on the objective. You know, is it about the overall message, the fluency, the accuracy, the grammar points, pronunciation? Absolutely right. So this is a slightly artificial task in that, you know, in the classroom, you would probably have decided what it is that you want to focus on specifically and what you want the learners to be focusing on. Whereas here, I'm asking you to comment on anything that you notice. But yeah, that is a good point. So things that have improved, the grammar, especially the tenses, pausing a bit better, but needs more work generally with the intonation and the pronunciation. Yeah. Okay, fewer mistakes. Yeah. General improvement, exercise. Yeah. This is the transcript, so you can see if you skim it that there is improvement in terms of accuracy. Slightly better range as well also. So in the first one it was cool, which doesn't really mean that much necessarily. It was really fascinating, slightly better. So improvements made, grammatical accuracy, individual sounds, so like rather than mispronunciation in the first attempt. Additional lexis, intonation and pronunciation still needs a bit more work. Okay, so really that was just to, you know, get you to be thinking about what you're noting down and how you're noting it down and how you then keep a record, how you feed back to your learner or learners, and then focusing on what they've improved as a result of that cycle. So yeah, you might say, fine, up to a point. That's, you know, me in the classroom as a teacher. I know that I need to be observing my students all the time and absorbing as much information as I can, making a note of it in whatever way you choose, feeding earlier on at the start of the session, and also, you know, that point about it's a combination of you, the teacher, the human in the classroom, doing things that digital tools and machines can't do in terms of the kind of things that you can notice and how you can then feed back to your learners. But, you know, what kind of digital tools can help to take some of that weight off your shoulders so that this kind of thing, that cycle of learning and assessment, practice testing, distributed practice can be taken also outside take online to help students also when they're working on things on their own at home, and potentially also to provide you with additional information about all of your students to add to the information that you gather for yourself in the classroom. So that are check how that's progressing when they've done further practice, maybe assess them again and going through that cycle, not humanly possible in terms of doing for all your students, or even point here being that there are digital tools now that make that some of that outside of the students, or what you can do paper-based tests with your key point down here. The role of the team is still really key out of the classroom when they're doing thing online at home. You taking an interest, showing to them that you're taking interest in the like that, could put this out with you interesting and useful, and if they to grade get better, so they could do areas and skills. I did when okay, and I mean, Russia have they've succeeded, and the instant nature of that feedback is very powerful. This along to again direct them to the practical needs. So if there's a particular area where they've got 80% system could direct them to a limited too much practice because they've done pretty well. If they get 20 or 30% that might direct them towards a greater number of practice activities because they need it. So basically, when you want it a specific for years, you don't okay for you, having based on the evidence of the test result and their performance in the test is reassure them that you need, and it's safe practice. After they've done all this practice, then ideally you want to then show them how much they've been, and so getting them to do in step 5 there. So I just heard a message recording stopped and then started again. Hopefully we're still recording. So as I was saying, after the practice, step 5, another test, which is a different test, but similar level of challenge and focusing on similar language and skills areas, so that, students, they should have improved after they've done that targeted practice, and we can then show them on a regular basis their improvement, which again will boost their motivation and maintain the motivation in the longer term. So a simple cycle like that, and ideally the tests done online, as I've said, automatically marked, so it's immediate for the learners, and you don't have to do the marking, covering various areas that they've been focusing on in class. No time is wasted. They're basically getting the practice that they need. Ideally also getting, feedback as they're going through this cycle, so that, it's helping to encourage them to keep going. So in this first graphic there, after they've done the first practice stage, they've only got 25% here. You can do better, go to practice 2, they go to practice 2, they do that, and then they take the second practice test. And then here they finished their grammar track, the grammar for this particular episode of study, this particular unit. They've done well, they've got 90%, so they get positive feedback. Important for them in terms of that, the motivation, as I've said. It's important also that the student can see, how well they're doing, how much they've done, how well they've done. It's useful if this is visible, at least initially, as a kind of snapshot view, rather than lots of numbers that they have to wade through to try and work out what's going on. So having a nice snapshot view like this, where they can see the green circles are the things that they've done well in, red not so well, and yellow is kind of in the middle, and also how much they've done, whether the circle is complete or not. So a student being able to see this for themselves, if they're younger learners, their parents also being able to see it. But then for you as a teacher, being able to see your class's performance in a similar kind of snapshot view before you drill into the detail. So seeing all of your students, the different units you've been covering, how well and how much they've done. So you can see this in the second row there, Evelyn. She seemed to start this course quite well. The first 2 units, she did everything, and she was getting really good results, between 90 and 100%. So that's showing up as green. But then you can see that in unit 3, something started to happen where she didn't complete the material, and also the performance wasn't quite so good. Then unit 4, she really dropped, and something was clearly going on here where she didn't do very much, and what she did, she didn't get very good scores at all. And then it's been a bit patchy since then. So this kind of snapshot view can give you, and this is all, remember, done online at home. It's not something you have to do in the classroom, but it gives you that information that you can then follow up on in class with your students. You can drill into detail as well. So if you want more information about a particular student, you can go in and have a look at what they've done in the different areas of the syllabus, in the different units, how much they've done and how well they've done it. So, this kind of information can potentially be, gold dust for you as a teacher in helping to inform what you do in the classroom. It can lead to more effective, more personalized learning, and lots of time saved for you as a teacher, because thinking about practice tests, and if they're done regularly and often, and if they're paper-based, thinking about my typical teaching scenario, it would be probably 5 classes of on average 20 students in each class. So we say that I have 100 students during the year, and I test them maybe at the end of every month, a progress test, a practice test at the end of every month, maybe 9 or 10 times a year. Let's say it's 10 tests a year, 100 students. That adds up to 1,000 individual tests in a year for me to mark and then analyze. Just the marking could be 10 minutes per test. 10,000 minutes, that's something like 170 hours. Potentially spent, you know, potentially done on a Sunday evening or whenever, when you could be doing things that, you know, only humans can do. So if you can get the machine, the digital tool to do this online, give students the immediate feedback and the scores, show you the results, then you save a whole load of time. And you can put that time to use for things that only you as a teacher can do and that digital tools can't do. So that, you know, potentially is the way that digital tools can help. And you may not be surprised to hear me mention that there is a solution that can do that for you, Options, which is a new course for lower secondary learners with a particular focus on mixed abilities and differentiated teaching and learning. And it includes that kind of digital system there that has that learning and assessment cycle, the practice testing, the distributed targeted practice for each individual learner taken outside of the classroom. That brings me to the end of the session. I think there's a couple of minutes left. Thank you very much for listening and for participating in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.